Hi, I'm Jared Palmer, if you follow me on GitHub or Twitter, and we're going to be talking about today server rendering. It's kind of tough. I've been doing it for a little while, and a little about me. So I've been doing some open source recently. My most popular project is called Formic. It's a form library for React. I've also done a thing called Backpack, which is a little wrapper around Webpack, but for backends. Razzle, and then today I also just released something called ReactFNS, which is called React Functions. It's if you're familiar with dateFNS, like a date utility library, the idea with React Functions, shameless plug here, is to be like a utility belt for React for modern like DOM APIs. So device and network and media and geoposition and like all in one place. You don't have to think about it. Like if there's a DOM API for it, there's a React FNS component for it and a higher order component for it. So if you have some time later, check that out. But today, I want to talk about a project of mine called Razzle. And before I get going on that, who here uses Create React App? Everybody, right? Like, it's awesome. Who here uses Next.js? All right, less. What's cool about that? It's great developer experience, right? It's awesome. It's like magical. If any of you came to React or from before the Create React App days, there was a lot of tears and pain when it came to setting things up with Webpack and configuring stuff, and it was just really confusing. And then server-side rendering is really awesome, but again, even harder to set up from a tooling perspective. And so Next definitely helped a lot of that, but I'll tell you the story about where I struggled about a year ago at this time when Next had just come out and what led me to build this thing called Razzle. So Razzle is really for dynamic content. And let's, before we get any further, talk about what a static site is and what a dynamic site is. So static sites, static HTML, it's a good old web page. And that is really, really great for anything or any type of startup that starts with app.blank.com. Like that's great for your SPA. You don't need to worry about SEO. And that covers most applications nowadays. But some applications, like media sites or like an Airbnb style app, needs to really dynamically render something every single time someone looks at a given route. And that's the kind of thing, that's the thing we want to be talking about today, because by just like throwing all SSR into one place, you really are neglecting some of the nuances towards the applications. And when you talk about the tooling required for each specific application, as it turns out, like you need to have a come to Jesus moment with like, well, do I actually need to serve dynamic content on every single page load? And the other thing you have to ask yourself about dynamic content is like, does it need to be on every single route? So if you opt for a framework like Create React App, you are throwing all of this conversation out the door. It's just going to be loaded on the client. You're going to have a very fat JavaScript client. If you're going to use something like Gatsby, you're going to say, well, I might have dynamic content, but I don't need it to be dynamic on the page load. It can be dynamic just at compile time. So I can request all my information and spit out a bunch of static HTML pages. If you need more dynamic content every single page load, you're sort of forced into a couple decisions. You can either use something like Next. You can use something called React Server, if you're familiar with that framework, or you can use something called Razzle, or you can sort of like roll your own thing. And rolling your own thing is just not a great idea for a lot of reasons. Ideally, you'd like to have your build tool abstracted so you can reuse it across different projects. And that was really popularized by Create React App. And so my goal with Razzle was to take this boilerplate that I had for this big SSR, dynamic SSR app, and roll it up into something that was kind of like Create React App. So the goal for the project was to build Create React App for server-side rendering. But about the same time, Next had just come out, and I was really into Next for a long time. It's got awesome developer experience. It has some opinions about the way you need to structure your application. Some of those are great. Some of those are, well, it's opinionated. It requires you to use a custom data fetching solution, a custom routing solution, which is based on folders. And well, you can do cool things like route preloading and stuff like that. It also server renders every single time. So I got into this, and it was really quite good for the first couple days. But started to hit a wall when it came to doing stuff with routing. And Michael Jackson, who's about to talk right after me, around like middle of this, like just dropped, him and Ryan dropped React Router 4. And I love React Router 4. It's awesome. It's like probably the best part of the React ecosystem. And React Router 4, if you're not familiar with it, makes routes into components, basically. There's no like concept of this like static thing that has to be done ahead of time. Like routes are dynamic as you want them to be. And I saw React Router and I was like, oh my gosh, I have to have this. Like we need to deal with this in server rendering. Like let's figure out how to do this. So what I ended up doing was figuring out a way to abstract away the build system of my JavaScript application for that universal JavaScript application, away from like the framework and libraries that I was going to use. And that ended up having some really interesting results, because once you abstract away the build tool and also like some of the framework decisions, it turns out you actually can protect yourself from the JavaScript fatigue that we all like suffer from daily, because by abstracting the build system away and being sort of more agnostic about the frameworks and data fetching and stuff like that, you actually have a better foundation to build on. And so I'll get to show you what Razzle feels like to use. So let's do just like a create React app. You can do yarn create Razzle app, and let's call this my demo. And then it's going to install a brand new SSR React app with React Router and a couple dependencies, hopefully. And while that does that, I'm going to get a beer. No, I'm not going to get a beer. Thought about getting a beer. I think it's going to be, maybe. Should have gotten the beer. Bummer. Nah, it's all good. I like had that planned out beforehand. I was like, I'm gonna go get a beer while this installs, and didn't quite work out that way.
Jared, I'll get you a beer if you zoom in.
Okay, yeah, so let's deal with that. Let's deal with that first. Word. Let's zoom in on that. All right, still installing because of, good thing I have a demo. So pretend that just installed, right? All right, let's open that up. So pretend that just installed perfectly, because it just did. And so what did I get? I got like, oh, sweet. So what did I get here? So I pop up my source directory, and it looks surprisingly like create React app. Oh my goodness. I have app.js, which is a nice little React Router route. I have my client mounting point. So this is going to be where the client mounts, and we're in React 16, so we're using the new hydrate function. I have my home route, which is going to look surprisingly like the create React app route in a second. And then I have my Express server. And like that's it. That's literally all it is. And the magic is that through the amazing power of Webpack, which is, as we know, like super awesome. Let's start this thing up. And let's bust open localhost. Oh my goodness, we have what looks to be like the same thing you always do when you create React app, right? Except, read that. That's some server rendering in there. Yeah. Boom. And even better than that, we crank this open here. If I go to home, I go say, welcome to Razzle, welcome to ReactNYC, save. Boom. You have hot reloading. And it just works. And that's that.
It's a tough crowd, Jared.
I know. So how does that work? It's kind of cool. There are two Webpack instances running. One handles the client bundle. The second handles the server bundle. So yeah, we're actually running Webpack on the Node server. And that allows you to basically use whatever framework you want, believe it or not. It doesn't actually just work with React. It works with Reason React. It works with Elm. It works with Vue. It works with Angular. Because it's actually just dealing with the Webpack parts. It's not doing any of the React stuff. While it comes with React and React Router as the default, as I'll show you right here, let's kill that one. This is, oops, let's kill this. So this is, I don't know if you guys ever seen Reason code, but this is some Reason code. And let's start this up with Razzle Reason React. And so we can see the side thing. So this is app.re instead of app.js, right? And again, the only dependency on this entire thing here that matters is Razzle. But you can, so again, let's, so it's starting localhost 3000, different app here. You got our counters, you got all that stuff. Again, server rendered, pretty sweet. And let's update something. When you make edits, Boom, more hot reloading awesomeness. Woohoo! Yeah, and let's do one more here. So in the Razzle repo, there are a bunch of examples. It works with Preact, it works with TypeScript, it works with Flow, it works with, like, as I mentioned, Elm, Inferno, whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. That's the whole point of it. The point is that, like, as the JavaScript fatigue sort of, as you embrace JavaScript fatigue and the new thing comes out, you can try it, right? Like, you're not going to be locked into some weird, like, linking system with, like, one way to fetch data. And that's important to me. It's important to the clients that I build apps for, that, like, we can pivot and move as fast as the ecosystem does. That's like a really, really big difference between, I think, even from the Create React app philosophy, which is like, this is the way it's done. And I think that's really important for the ecosystem to have, like, the blessed Facebook way of doing something. Unlike that, Razzle lets you create a custom configuration file. And so if you need to modify that underlying Webpack config, you can just do it. It's not like, let's pull up that Elm one. I think the Elm one has some, let's the demo with Elm. So you open up razzle.config.js and it's just a function. So if who here's used React Storybook or something like that? Yeah, so like same thing. You basically can modify the Webpack configuration as you wish. I give you the config. You can do whatever you want. Add a loader, add some crazy Babel thing that Henry wrote in the back. Shout out to Henry. Everybody loved that. Babel's great. Yeah, so you basically have a free-for-all here, and with that, like, you can do some pretty interesting stuff. One of the things that's pretty cool that this allows me to do is something with React Router that's kind of interesting. So instead of rendering every single, let's go here, React. Let's go, hold on one second here. So one of the things you can do with this, with React Router 4, which is kind of interesting, yeah, you can do Next.js like data fetching if you wanted to, right? So you don't have to go away with this whole, like, page concept. So powered by Razzle, what you would do is, if you wanted to, like, make yourself your own Next.js, but with React Router per se, you just, like, specify a route config statically, and on the server, you traverse your routes.
Zoom in.
Oh, sorry. You can traverse your routes, call, like, get initial data, and then inject it into the page, and then you're done. It's the same thing. So you don't have the vendor lock-in, you don't have the churn, you don't have, just a lot of things are mitigated. You're in total control. And so for me, being a little bit of a control freak when it comes to, like, decisions about the way my app is done or data's fetched, like, that's really important. And so I hope that, you know, if you haven't checked it out already, you'll think about Razzle for your next thing that needs dynamic server rendering. Again, I would urge you, though, like, don't jump to server rendering too soon. Have it as someone who's, like, built a gigantic application with server rendering, avoid it at all costs until you have to. Like, build your app client side, maybe deal with auth server side, but then, like, only render on the client. And then, like, the day you launch, like, then deal with server side rendering, because it is such a pain to deal with it ahead of time. And until you know, like, if you're a startup, like, until your app's laid out, like, you don't need to be fetching data like that. But if you do, what's cool is you can actually move from Create React App to Razzle pretty similarly, because it supports exactly the same CSS. It's just almost an identical Babel transformation. So it's actually quite easy to move from Create React App to Razzle if you just decide you need server rendering on one day. And I would really, really suggest you, like, think deeply before you go full out in on, like, I need to server render every single page of my application. If you're like building a new site, okay, fine. If you're Airbnb, okay, fine. But if you're not, like, I would just urge you, please, next time, just think of this presentation, think of this moment. Be like, oh wait, yeah, Jared, he totally told me not to do this. and I will smile and like you'll thank me later, because the pain is non-trivial. So with that, just like to say thanks to Stash, and thanks to Ilya and the whole team at the ReactNYC. Any questions?
So first of all, awesome job with that last, especially like static analysis of the routes and like setting them up ahead of time. I was literally just talking to Ryan last week, and we were like, one of us should do this, because like I don't think people are getting this yet. And so awesome job on that. That was super solid. So you said don't do server rendering until like the day you launch, right? Until the very end.
Yeah.
What's the story there with like Razzle, right? So if I go and I build out my entire app client side, how easy is it to just be like, oh, I need server rendering, let me drop this in, you know? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, totally. So I would argue, and so my argument would be that the pain you're going to ensue to refactor all your data. So before we go any further, in order to do server-side rendering in React, you have to fetch all of your data before it renders. Yep. So that means you have to inject it from the top of the application all the way down to all the leaves. Whereas in a client-side application, you can basically fetch data like anywhere you want, and it's all over the place. And so depending on how like hygienic you are about your data fetching with containers and stuff, that either could be a very easy switch or a very painful switch. My argument is that that switch is less pain than starting from scratch server-side rendering. Yeah. So, and it's usually, again, as it turns out, only a couple routes you're going to need to do that on. Yeah. So, so like your settings, like I've never found a settings in any application that ever needed to be server rendered, right? So it's something that never needs to be server. You don't need SEO on your settings pages, right? So if it's like your home page or a couple of marketing pages, or maybe just parts of your application, again, like my argument is that like it's going to be easier and faster for you to develop client side, and then when the day comes, like go tooling and figure that out. Like Google, but it will take you less time to like refactor than Google will to like pick up that you just launched your application. And I've sacrificed the pain. The one thing I will say though is that the move from client-side authorization to server-side or isomorphic authorization is kind of tricky. You have to set a cookie instead of using a token, and so that's probably the biggest like hurdle to deal with. But after you do that, like it's not that, again, I don't think it's as painful as starting from the beginning with server rendering. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Can you just elaborate on maybe like a pain point that you ran into dealing with server-side rendering? Just as a developer of like a server-side framework, I'm curious to see what your thoughts are on like why it's such a pain to deal with.
I think the thing that gets me the most sometimes is, I don't use that much Redux, but more, like I'm not one of like Redux like zealots. It's like everything goes in Redux, but there's a little bit of Redux in the application that I'm thinking about right now. But basically, the issue I see a lot that comes up is you have something that's hydrated, that's like that's server rendered, and it needs to get some sort of update, and that update changes with authentication or something like that. And you need to use like a lifecycle method, like component will receive props or component did update, and you forget, and then you have no idea why something didn't update, and you're confused, and then you have this weird discrepancy between client side and server side. And that's like from the React side of things. From the tooling side of things, that problem is mostly mitigated with Razzle, so I don't really have like massive tooling issues as much anymore. There's still some stuff that's kind of tricky, like dealing with, I don't know, SVGs can be, there's like, we were using some crazy Babel transform for SVGs that had to get rid of that from we moved to TypeScript, but that was more like a tooling problem that was like maybe exacerbated by SSR, but like for the most part, I think the trickiness it gets with, the tricky part of this is you have stuff coming from two places. And with something like Next.js, for example, you basically only have one place to define your data. It's in that get initial props function, right? So on every single request, it's going to call the same exact function. And so, but with Razzle, you don't have that kind of constraint. So you can do cool stuff like, I'm only going to get my cookie one time, get my like token one time, and then I don't need to get it again because I know I have it once it's loaded. And so just playing with that, those can be both like very liberating, but can be also quite painful if you aren't careful. But I would say like just managing the difference between server stuff and client stuff is still just challenging at every single moment. Like, one of the reasons why I say like do it the last possible moment. If you want to feel like read a good article that I don't know gets enough play anymore, go to, I think Pete Hunt has something called React How To. Is that right? Like React How To? Yeah, just read that and like follow that because he's a genius and like Pete like made all this and he made it all possible. But yeah, it basically tells you like how to get into React, and I would follow that like very heavily.
Thanks a lot.
Oh, okay.